Is the goal to make every character in the game perfectly balanced and playable? That seems kind of boring, potentially lead to predefined outcomes in team fights. I personally don't think that should be the goal. You know, everybody's going to have their own opinions on how the game should be balanced. My opinion on how the games should be balanced is League of Legends thrives when a large number of champions feel viable and playable to the people who like them. And the reason I believe that, the reason that's my belief and like how I think about the game is two factors. Number one is we know that people really enjoy playing League of Legends when they find a character they love, potentially multiple characters they love. And so if you're someone who likes Rek'Sai, ideally Rek'Sai feels good to play. If you're someone who likes Bard, ideally Bard feels good to play. If you're someone who loves Yasuo, ideally Yasuo feels good to play. And so part of it is League of Legends benefits when players who are very different, like you have millions of players who all have different preferences, can find characters they love and feel like the character they love is playable and viable and fun, right? So that's one side of it. The other side of it is League of Legends also becomes more fun when you experience variety. And one of the best ways to put variety into the game is to change up the champions you experience. And this doesn't mean we should like nerf popular champs. I'm not saying like, oh, you see Yasuo every game, get rid of him. But I am saying that like when there's a large number of champions that like their mains can feel are viable, you're more likely to then run into them. And then when you run into them, it's like that's a different game, right? And so it's like, as an example, it's like, is it important that Kled is super popular? No. But I think it's highly valuable that Kled feels strong to Kled players, both because then Kled players are happy, and because then you'll see a little more Kled than you normally would. Obviously, he's never going to be super popular, but there's a big difference between, like, you know, him in 0.5% of your games and 1.5% of your games. And then when you see Kled, that is a different experience that, in the long term, makes League of Legends more interesting. And so I generally take an approach when I think about character design and character balance to be like, what are ways that you can make these characters, you know, all have some feeling of viability and enjoyment for their mains, well, you know, ensuring they're like, you know, decent to play against as well. And this gets to like some really philosophical musings for game balance, okay? And so because on one hand it's like, is the best game the game that's the most objectively balanced? On the other hand, is the best game the game that feels the most balanced? And like, you know, there's probably some middle ground there, right? And so, like, as an example, let's say there's an item, and we strongly believe that item is good for the game, but no one's buying it. What should we do? Actually, let's put it these. There's an item. We believe it's good for the game. In this like fairy tale example, good for the game just means the game is like, you know, better, whatever that means. So there's an item. It's good for the game. Makes the game better. It's balanced, and no one picks it. But we're fairly confident it's balanced. We're fairly confident that like this is a fair item. It's well tuned in regards to the other items, etc., etc. So item, good for the game, balanced, no one picks it. What do you do? One of the things you could do is leave it the way it is and just say, well, it's balanced. And players just don't seem to realize it. But when they do, you know, they'll figure it out eventually, and then they can go pop off of that item, right? Another thing you could do is you could make it deliberately overpowered, right? You could be like, well, if people aren't picking up on it, let's help them out, right? And you could just make it OP. That has the benefit of suddenly now it's picked. And remember, we said in this example it's good for the game, so it being picked is not necessarily a bad thing. On the flip side of things, though, oh my god, I got a Chaos Orb. On the flip side of things, though, you've done something a little illegal, right? You've deliberately mistuned the game to create an outcome. But again, then it comes back to, well, if the outcome is the game is better, is that a bad outcome, even if the game has been, in quotes, mistuned? And the reason I bring this up is like it's a philosophical thing to talk about, is like, what is the balanced philosophy and what matters here? We have an item like this already. It's called Flash. Flash is mistuned because it's overpowered. If you compare Flash to the other summoner spells, it is overpowered because it has taken far more than them, and the other ones just aren't nearly as powerful. We could tune Flash to be balanced, in quotes, compared to the other summoner spells. You give it a long enough cooldown, you give it shorter range, right? Like, Flash could be tuned to a spot where it is balanced compared to the other summoner spells. But that wouldn't necessarily make the game better, because it turns out there's a very strong argument for League of Legends is a better game when Flash is tuned to be powerful. And I generally agree with that argument, by the way. I think that is correct. Where is this place? Maybe up here? I'd nerf the alternatives and buff them later. That's another option, right? You could just say, well, if this thing is good and it's not being picked, perhaps you nerf the competition, right? And so you don't achieve it by like buffing the thing to be OP, but instead you like make it so that its competition isn't as good, so people are more likely to choose it. I think this whole conversation also gets into this kind of idea that, like, you know, balancing a game is somewhat a balancing act. Emphasis on act, right? Because just as important as a game being objectively balanced and fair and things like that is how your community perceives the balance of the game and how they perceive the game to play out. And that's something you really have to think about. And there's not necessarily easy answers. Physiologist, thanks for 6 months, dude. It's kind of impossible to balance every champion. Like, there's a champion made to be for the OTP, like Gangplank. No, his kit is really hard, and you get to combo and stuff by only spamming him. Yeah, so, like, that's the question, though, is, like, so again, like, what is the definition of balanced, then, right? One of the things you could say is everybody's 50% win rate. And so then it's like, well, that's actually kind of hard to balance Gangplank, because he's for OTPs, right? A Gangplank at 50% win rate is actually probably overpowered, depending on what your balance metrics are, right? But again, it depends on like what you mean by balance. And so one of the things I've been talking about that I think is like, well, I think what's important for Gangplank's balance is that Gangplank feels viable and powerful for the people who play him. This is the idea that if you invest time into Gangplank, it feels worthwhile and he's a powerful character. That doesn't necessarily mean he needs to be a 50% win rate, right? That could mean there's versions of Gangplank that feel very powerful at 47. Rise is a great example of this. So Rise, for years, was balanced to 40% win rate, or 40 to 44% win rate because of pro play. But something that's important to note about Rise during that time, here, I'll show you, was that he was significantly more popular than he is now. Here, I'll show you. Let's go take a look at his graphs really quick. So, oh my god, is it going to lag out on me again? Come on. This site is like bugged to hell. Okay. Sorry, this is just ads everywhere. It's pretty bad. Okay, so this is Rise, right? And look at his popularity. Nowadays, he's right here, and he's actually gotten a recent spike this year, but like, you know, if you look back in history, Rise, even in the era where he was like, you know, balanced at like 40, 44, was actually meaningfully more popular, right? So his popularity is somewhat cratered, even though nowadays he's much more, in quotes, balanced. Nowadays, Rise is much more closer to 50% win rate, much more powerful for the average person in terms of playing it. But whereas comparatively, old Rise lost a ton of games, but he also had like a lot of skill expression and things like that. And so it's kind of a thing where it's like, new Rise is probably more balanced numerically, but it's very possible he doesn't like feel as good to play for his players as Old Rise did, given, you know, how he's kind of like fallen off in terms of popularity. So that's the question. Is like, on one hand, you have guy who is probably more balanced statistically and more playable, legitimately more playable by the average player. On the other hand, you have guy who's very, very hard to balance statistically, very, very difficult to succeed on, but for whatever reason seems to have felt a lot more powerful and viable and playable to people in that state, right? And so which one of those is the better balance?